Hello, this is William LaForest, and this is the History Podcast. And today with us,
The
we are going to
Gillespie.
have.
I'm Andy, and I'm going to be the manager of this podcast. I'll be responsible for all the uploads and editing and stuff like that.
I'm Christian, and I'll be here.
Excellent. Well, uh, right, today we are going to be discussing the Cold War and specifically instances where the Cold War could have gone nuclear and the outcome, if such a thing, would have occurred. So the Cold War is something that's probably familiar to a lot of people, especially since it didn't end that long ago, and most people were alive when it was occurring. So leading up to the Cold War, you already had pre-existing tensions between the Western world and the Bolsheviks. However, these seemed to subside during and after the Second World War, but they quickly rose back up again as the Eastern and Western blocs began to form and the Soviet forces and the U.S. took measures to distance themselves from each other. So the first instance where we've decided that a strong possibility for the Cold War to have gone nuclear was if something known as Operation Unthinkable, which was proposed by Winston Churchill, had been enacted. And what Operation Unthinkable was is that it was basically if Allied forces had not stopped at Germany, but had continued forward into Soviet occupied Poland and Eastern Europe in order to bring those back under the West's control. Um, so, do you guys have any comments on this before we start?
Um, all I would say is, I think if that happened, the USSR was. Well, I think the thing was that they thought that the USSR was very far away from getting nuclear weapons, so that was the main pretense to this. So they would be able to just completely steamroll to Moscow before they were able to get nuclear weapons. But that was actually pretty wrong because they got nuclear weapons way earlier than the U.S. or Great Britain
Okay,
thought they would be able to get.
I agree with that, but I do think that so nuclear weapons, as we know, are just super powerful, and I don't think the Soviet Union got nuclear weapons until 48, I believe, is when they got nuclear weapons. And
But
if we had attacked before then, we probably could have. The U.S. probably could have defeated the Soviet Union.
well, that
I
was
mean, keep
still.
in mind there were really only three major spots that we really needed to hit in the Soviet Union. If we hit Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, maybe even Kiev, probably Kiev would be one of our important targets. If we hit those 3 to 4 cities, Soviet resistance would be completely collapsed. I say we, as in the U.S. We are American.
Yes.
Yes, we are.
But the time they got nuclear weapons was still, I'm pretty sure it was like 5 years before the U.S. actually expected them to get nuclear weapons because they just stole all the information.
Well,
So
Operation Unthinkable would have been during World War II. Like, there wouldn't have even been a treaty signed. Churchill proposed that we immediately turned on the Soviet Union as soon as Nazi Germany fell, before a treaty was even signed. And we just pushed into Eastern Europe. So there would have been a window of time where we would have been at war with them and had nuclear weapons. And we didn't have a ton, but we certainly had enough so that it could have been devastating for the Soviet Union, which would have not necessarily have been the greatest, because while it would have meant that you had a Western Bloc Poland, there would have been a lot of fallout from the use of nuclear weapons. We Allied forces would have basically no restrictions whatsoever on when to use them, and I consider it less of could the U.S. have won and more of were they willing to have would they have been willing to have caused the devastation and casualties that a nuclear war could have resulted in? Because they probably could have eventually broken the Soviet Union just under the sheer force of basically unrestricted nuclear warfare with no opposition.
Yeah, I agree with that.
okay, yeah. Do you guys have any thoughts on what would have been the ultimate effects of this actually happening, and what would be the consequences of this in
Well,
kind of modern
nuclear
day?
fallout would definitely affect just all of Europe in general. Even if it was just targeted towards the Soviet Union, nuclear fallout can travel miles
Very
on
far.
miles, and that would affect in at least the entirety of Europe, and all the smoke and smog
Demographically speaking,
that
Russia would have a much smaller population if we hit up all their major population centers.
yeah, and also I think the
But like,
Politically, it would mean that the Western Bloc would be larger and democracy would be spread further, which is good or bad depending upon where you stand on the issue. But yeah, it does mean that probably Winston Churchill was a strong advocate of restoring the original Polish government. So it does mean that communism would be probably mostly eliminated outside of Eastern Asia.
but do you think there might
Communism
be
in Europe would be eliminated.
a pretty big political backlash to this? Like, we just had this war and now we're starting another offensive, and I feel like that would be very damaging politically.
Oh yeah, totally. And
it
especially
also
since it was an undeclared war against an ally, and we also utilized nuclear weapons against the Soviets, who were the defender in the war. So it's a very definitely under Operation Under Unthinkable was definitely a very dirty, underhanded war, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Also,
Do you have any thought on
I
this,
feel like the
Andy?
soldiers' morale would be like, or just the morale of in general. Like we already just suffered this
Yeah,
great world
I think
war. Just everyone wouldn't be up to do it, and I think
it would be the public would be very against it.
yeah, and
I
they'd
think
be
that's probably
very
one of
against
the
this.
major reasons why they didn't do it.
And what's interesting is that I think that in some aspects, communism in other parts of the world might have actually fared better because I think with the elimination of the Soviet Union as a power, we're assuming in this scenario that, of course, a pro American Russian government would be installed. With Europe under firm Western control, it's most likely that the US would probably take a very non interventionist approach to foreign policy and probably become maybe even an isolationist nation again. Which means that despite the fact that the Soviet Union, the main backer of communist regimes worldwide, had fallen, communism in other parts of the world would probably do better without having to worry about US intervention.
But they also wouldn't have the backing of a Soviet state, right?
Oh, the Soviet Union, yes.
Yeah.
But there were instances where nations would flip to communism without the Soviet Union. And I think the China could sort of fill the role of the Soviet Union, albeit they were probably had less power projection capability at that point in history than the Soviet Union did. So the next major hotspot or potential area during the Cold War where it could have gone hot, so to speak, is the Korean War because that was still very early into the Cold War. Boundaries in standard operating procedures in proxy wars had not been fully fleshed out and established. I guess superpower protocol and proxy wars had not been established. And also in the Korean War specifically, you had a lot of war hawk U.S. generals like Douglas MacArthur, who were advocating for the use of tactical nuclear weapons against the Soviet and Chinese forces in Korea and Manchuria. Well, the Korean War started because after the Second World War, Japanese occupied Korea was split up between the North and the South, and the North was very much heavily under Soviet influence, and while the South was under American influence, the U.S. Was surprisingly light-handed in South Korea. They definitely were much more involved in the occupation of Korean than of Japan than South Korea. They is really only the northern invasion of South Korea which prompted U.S. intervention in the region and further nation building by the U.S. in South Korea. Um, and so the Korean War started when the leader of North Korea, Kim Il Sung, authorized a North Korean attack against South Korea, at which point the Soviet Union, North Korea invaded South Korea, backed by the Soviet Union, and made significant gains. At which point, a coalition of nations led by the United States, along with some United Nations forces, defended against North Korea and pushed them far back. However, the tides of the war were changed once again when they pushed North Korea far back enough so that China felt threatened and they began sending their forces to assist in the war, which caused a stalemate with the two nations. And at that point, soon after, a ceasefire was declared, and well, not technically, North and South Korea until very recently were technically still at war, but an end to the conflict took place, and the new borders were established along the lines of fighting.
All right, so it was when China mobilized its forces, as when the proposal for nuclear weapons to be used was
Yes,
established, right?
yeah, because up until that point, the Western forces and did not really struggle against North Korea because Soviet backing of North Korea was limited mostly to just aerial support. You had Soviet fighter jets in North Korea, but it wasn't until Chinese assistance where the Chinese sent in just lots and lots and lots of feet on the ground soldiers to assist in Korea, where the West actually began to struggle. And then you had figures like Douglas MacArthur advocating for the use of nuclear weapons in the war.
All right, so I believe that if it went nuclear at that point, um, the Soviets probably would have interfered and launched back nuclear weapons as well.
I think it depends how nuclear would go, because if the Douglas MacArthur just wanted to make a statement, and I don't know if like dropped a bomb to get, I don't know, try to show that he was willing to go that far, it could have gone two ways, where China would retreat their armies and the U.S. would just keep North Korea, or China would like go to the Soviet Union for help and tell them that the U.S. was threatening to attack them with nuclear weapons, and then a huge war might start.
Yeah, I reckon it's important to keep in mind China itself did not have nuclear weapons at this point. Um, I think for the U.S. actions in the war, there would be an equal and opposite Soviet reaction. And another thing worth keeping in mind is that the Soviet Union did not have super strong capabilities to hit the U.S. with nuclear weapons at this point. However, they literally bordered Korea. So I think what would have happened is there are a few scenarios. Either the U.S. uses tactical use of nuclear weapons to hit troop formations in Korea, and the Soviet Union retaliates by launching nuclear weapons at U.S. allies in Europe. Or alternatively, the two nations come to an almost agreement to use nuclear weapons exclusively within the proxy conflict in Korea, which does mean that the initial, which does mean that despite being probably way larger and higher casualty figures in the Korean War, it does mean that this is a miniaturized nuclear war contained within a proxy conflict.
I still think if that happened, it'd still end up it would still end up with a full out nuclear war, because by that time the glass ceiling is broken and they're willing to use nuclear weapons, and the losing side would just end up maybe pushing the boundaries a little bit further by nuking a different place. Then they would get even further and further and further until it just ends up to full out nuclear war at that point.
It does set a dark precedent for
Yeah.
future proxy conflicts.
Um, uh, I'm not sure. I think if they did reach an agreement, I don't know if it would have went out in just all nuclear war and
Well, I'm not saying
everyone
that
gets
would immediately
annihilated.
happen. I would say there'd be, like Will said, a precedent where it's, it's getting to a point where it's going to become normal to use nuclear weapons in proxy wars, and then it's not going to be as big of a scare factor as nuclear weapons are right now. As in, like, I guess
Another issue.
Yeah.
Sorry.
no, you can do it.
Another issue with the use of nuclear weapons in proxy conflicts is that typically these proxy conflicts are taking place in less developed post-colonial nations, which means that if nuclear weapons are being used tactically during these proxy wars, these nations, which already were dealt a very tough hand in the development of their nation and economy, are going to have it even harder if nuclear weapons start being utilized in their proxy conflicts. So I think outside of the Western and Eastern blocks, the developing world is going to struggle even more than it already did and is in our timeline.
I would like to go back to the point that using nuclear weapons in these proxy wars will create sort of this idea that or some more acceptable to use nuclear weapons in just proxy wars. I don't think it'll be like that because in World War One they used like mustard gas, right?
Yeah.
And that was seen as because it was used on both sides, so everybody uh, was using it during this war, but they never used it again. So I think it'll be
Well, you
sort
could,
of the same thing with these nuclear weapons in proxy wars. Is that they'll come to an agreement to only use it in the Korean War in that Korea and Manchuria area, and they will probably not use it again
But with
because
mustard gas, I think you. Sorry.
they'll see the destructive effects of it because I think what happened in World War One was they realized that mustard gas was too harmful, I guess, and they'll see that with nuclear weapons, and that they won't continue using it anymore. Is what I think would happen.
I mean, yeah, there's obviously that's a good point. Mustard gas doesn't get used again, but I think that you can make the argument that mustard gas isn't used again simply because it isn't effective. Nuclear weapons are so effective that it'd be hard for nations to resist not using them if the possibility is open. Mustard gas kind of stopped being used after World War One because it requires both sides or one of the sides to be maintaining a stationary position. And in the more mobile World War II and post World War II wars, where mustard gas sees you, where fighting takes place after World War II, the wars tend to be more guerrilla warfare oriented and mobile in nature. And the only stationary war that you see during the era of the Iraq Iran conflict, mustard gas actually does get utilized again.
Mm.
yeah, I think it essentially just lays a precedent that like nuclear weapons are okay, and with the nuclear weapons getting stronger and stronger, it's just going to lead to more and more damage, and just I don't know how to say this. It's just there's going to be an end up where there's a mistaken something goes wrong, and I don't know. There's a mistake between communications, and with just any nuclear weapons being used in situations, it's just going to lead to more and more. I don't know. I don't know how to say this, but like,
It leaves open a larger possibility
yeah,
for error resulting in global nuclear war.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's definitely true.
yeah. I see
Um,
that.
And also the damage it would do to the country, like Will said, it would be catastrophic. I mean, there might just not be a Korea left by the end of that war with nuclear weapons.
and then also, it does mean that nuclear war weapons are no longer even a deterrent. They're an active tool to be used by
Yeah,
nations, which means that nuclear stockpiles amassed by these powers in the Cold War are going to be even larger.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that.
But
Okay,
there is also a possibility for it to remain contained to Korea if 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 there's enough public backlash against it, or if just the generals decide that it's too cruel, which
but
could
I think
happen.
you know if they're gonna go with the generals going with using nuclear weapons in Korea, I don't think these generals are just gonna be like, we just got Korea, and we've done it so well because we use these nuclear weapons. We should just that they're just gonna be willing to stop in Korea, and they aren't just gonna keep going into China. You know, like I just don't see how these, like you said, Warhawk um, generals aren't just gonna keep pushing into China like if
That
they
is
allow
character.
them.
That would be a very
Yeah,
MacArthur thing to do, to
yeah,
not stop at
because
the
they would
North
just
Korean border and try to push his luck, so to
yeah.
speak, and get a piece of Manchuria as well.
Exactly, and it's just going to keep getting more and more and more until finally the Soviet Union steps in big, and then it's just going to go all out, you know.
Yeah, I don't think the Soviet
yeah.
Union would allow it to swing too heavily in the U.S.'s favor.
And also PR wise, it would be pretty bad. I feel like for the public for us to be using nuclear weapons.
Oh yeah, we would totally be the bad guys in the
Yeah.
Korean War if we started using the nuclear
That would
weapons.
just be propaganda like heaven for Soviet Union.
And I mean, for good reason if we started using them first.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
that was one
especially
of
in
the
the
main
Korean
deterrents.
War, more so than any other proxy war, we can actually claim to be in the right since we were technically defending South Korea.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right.
Yeah.
I think we did this pretty well. Should we go into the
Any more
next one?
comments, maybe?
I agree now. Yeah,
The next one.
with your position, Will.
All right. There's nothing wrong with disagreeing, though. I have been known to be wrong. I
just
know,
wasn't,
it's shocking.
I guess informed enough about the whole mustard gas thing. But yeah,
I think that was
I see
good.
your point now.
We can go to the next one. I think.
All right, so the next big one is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's a really big one. And by this point, the Soviet Union has had time to build up and recover from World War II fully. And this is one of the first instances of the Soviet Union really projecting power outside of their designated sphere in East Asia and Eastern Europe. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred after a little bit after the old Cuban government under Baptiste was overthrown by a communist insurgency, and the Soviet Union began sending missile parts to set up missile bases in Cuba to use as a counterbalance to U.S. missile bases in Europe and Anatolia, or Turkey. And so the Cuban Missile Crisis almost escalated because the U.S. Planes picked up that the Soviet missile bases were being constructed in
They
Cuba.
saw the SAMs.
Yeah, so the U.S. Began a blockade. No, quarantine. They didn't call it a blockade because that was a war crime.
Technically a blockade.
Yeah, I can't remember the
Quarantine.
difference between a naval quarantine and a blockade.
One's not an actual.
Is there a difference, or were they just calling it that so
I think
it
they were
wouldn't be
just
considered a
calling-
war crime?
Probably.
I'm not too sure. They were probably just calling it to avoid it being a
Yeah,
war
yeah,
crime.
definitely.
There's probably some sort of nuanced difference, like where they check what the ships are sending in and allow like food supplies to be sent in. But yes, they basically established a blockade along Cuba, and U.S. and Soviet ships entered a standoff, and it got to the point where people were so sure that it was going to come to nuclear war that the U.S. was actually giving people days off from work to spend what they thought was going to be the last few days of their existence with their families. Right. So I don't think it needs to be too extensively explained why this could have led to nuclear war. I just think it's a matter of where are the Soviets going to hit. The U.S. can hit anywhere in the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union is a little bit more restricted as to where it can hit the U.S. because I don't believe at this point the missile bases in Cuba were fully operational. Were they?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure if they were, but assuming they were operational, it did basically cover the entire United States.
But if they weren't operational, then the Soviet Union would be much more restricted. They'd have to hit northern U.S. targets from basically their bases in northern Siberia. They'd have to hit over the Earth, like over Antarctica, into the U.S. that way. Or they might even just be restricted to hitting up U.S. allies in Europe.
So the consequences of this, it would just be like when
it'd be total
the US
nuclear annihilation
Yeah,
if it went to war at that point. Both sides had a strong enough capability so that it would be severe.
pretty technically, yeah.
Although it might be total nuclear annihilation in the U.S.'s favor because the Soviet Union might struggle more. So the first society to face total and utter collapse might be the Soviet Union.
But the US
Well, if the Soviet
it'd be
Union,
quickly on our way to being destroyed.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, we'd get to laugh, but we'd get the last laugh, so to speak. But it
Last
would
laugh
be
in the
in
world, yeah.
yes, the last laugh in the world.
well, maybe Africa survives or South America, you know.
Restart.
I don't know. I mean,
I don't know. Yeah, it'd be pretty
we
bad.
we might pull in some of our Latin American allies, and Cuba certainly would not survive.
I mean, the bombs were pretty strong at this point in the war. I
Yeah.
feel like
Yeah, some places
they
in
Uh,
had
Africa
H
might have.
bombs, right?
I'm trying to
They
think.
hide.
The only Cold War nations in Africa, I mean, the Egyptians were loosely aligned with the Soviet Union. I don't know if we would have hit them with bombs over that though. And I would say that South Africa was loosely aligned with the US at this point, but neither were part of any formal agreements with either side.
So, do you think there's a chance, any chance, that if that the tanker had just kept going, it would have been a bluff by the U.S. and they wouldn't have actually fired missiles?
I honestly, I, I I can't claim to know enough about the Cuban Missile Crisis to say for sure. I think it also depends on who is in charge of those ships and whether they would have had the guts to follow through with it. What do
But
you
I'm just
think?
saying, like, for if the tanker didn't stop, do you think there's a chance that it actually was a bluff and that they would not have actually fired missiles?
I don't know. I don't know enough to make a determination on
I
that,
mean, it's like it's a young president, Kennedy. He's
Kennedy.
maybe isn't as war hardened, and he might have just I don't know.
I mean, yeah, Kennedy was more cautious in his foreign policy in general, I believe. Um, but at the same time, I don't know for sure if Kennedy would have wanted to have allowed a nuclear a nuclear armed nation right next to the US like Cuba. Like that's a threat to national security and it would have looked terrible for him had it occurred.
Fair. But should we also
oh,
talk about a
speaking
little bit?
of Kennedy, he did try to overthrow the Cuban government, though, right? Bay of Pigs. They just
That was
Yeah,
that
with the
was
Bay of
but
more
Pigs
of
why?
a,
division.
Do you know?
that was more of an Eisenhower idea though, and he just had like
In fact,
right,
Kennedy actually called off certain aspects. The US was initially going to be
yeah,
more involved in
send
it
way
than it
more
was going to
planes,
be.
right?
Then they scaled
And
back
actually,
their
fun
They had
fact,
operation.
higher cover.
my grandfather was actually one of the people responsible for organizing the Bay of Pigs invasion and doing logistics for it.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, this is a fun fact. Yeah, I don't consider that a really a Kennedy thing so much as it was a U.S. military thing. I
Well,
don't know how much of the plan he was filled in on. I think he knew of it. I don't know if he was in on all the details or not, though.
wasn't Eisenhower wasn't he? He was certain that Nixon would win the election and be able to like follow through with kind of the similar thinking that he had with this, with the Bay of Pigs, because Nixon knew about it, and had like helped plan it, and he thought they would just be able to keep going straight from Eisenhower to Nixon, but Nixon lost, and now Eisenhower had to explain all the plans to um,
Kennedy?
Kennedy, yeah,
I honestly did
and
not know that. That's
that
really
kind of
interesting.
like was a weird thing, and so that's how it like kind of like all the training kind of went bad because of that transition period, and just everything just didn't seem to line up very well
Yeah, the Bay
between
of Pigs
and
was a little bit of a
Yeah,
disaster.
yeah,
that's why the
and
invasion
the
failed.
people, their whole plan was get the local population to help them, but that never worked, and it was just they had pulled out air cover, and that just all really fell apart. But yeah, that wasn't a great thing.
You know why they want to? Because I believe one of the reasons they scaled back the operation was they wanted to conceal their involvement with it.
Well, yeah,
The US wanted
the
to.
planes that they had given it, and they had given them some like pretty old bombers, and they had like repainted them and stuff to have the
I suppose it would look somewhat suspicious if a Cuban armed anti communist militia had aerial bombing support.
Yeah,
well,
I
they
guess.
had the U.S. gave them like 5 bombers, like kind of old bombers. I forgot which type they were, but they were given bombers. But they were pretty bad. They were easily destroyed by some of the
So I guess
fighters
that
that
does sort of answer
Cuban
your
had.
question of maybe it was a bluff. Maybe Kennedy wouldn't be willing to
Yeah,
go the extra mile, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with stepping down when humanity's survival as a race depends upon it. But yeah, maybe that does demonstrate that it was a bluff and he wouldn't have been willing to fire on the Soviet ship. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I feel like the whole kind of this whole Cold War is kind of almost like a huge bluff. You know, the whole Cold War of these two people saying
It's
that they're
like
going to
these two
destroy the world.
superpowers
Yeah,
playing chicken.
yeah, exactly. And you don't know which one might pull out. I mean, this is kind of going on to our next point, but there's instances of where people didn't like go into the full didn't actually fire even though there was like warning signs where they should have, and in like a normal situation they would have. So I don't know. You don't know. It's all
well, I
perspective.
think in that situation at least, the one where what else? The number switched to 5 in some nuclear detection system. I think at least in that situation, wasn't Khrushchev visiting America at that point in time? So they
Well,
knew.
was he actually going to the U.S.? I didn't know
I
that.
think,
Was he?
but this is a little off topic.
It's a
We
little
can
I
off
don't know.
talk
I
about
topic,
think
but
that's interesting. I think that might have affected
I
the
think
Soviet response.
and this may have been a different situation, but either it was like Khrushchev was visiting America at that time, so it wouldn't make sense for the Soviets to launch missiles at that point, or it was because the people didn't believe that the Russians would launch missiles, so they trusted their gut and they're correct. Because it wouldn't suddenly jump from like 0 to 5 randomly with no warning.
They were like estimating that would be like 250 missiles. I'm pretty sure. It was like
but it was a pretty. I think it was a pretty big amount, but I don't think it would have instantly jumped. Is what I'm saying, and I think they questioned that. Like, why was there no warning signs of this beforehand? Because it sort of just miraculously happened.
Yeah. But coming back to this, is there anything left we should say about Bay of Pigs and Cuban Missile Crisis? Should we
I think
say
it would have been total nuclear annihilation.
we would not exist anymore? We wouldn't be able to do this podcast.
Yeah,
That's pretty much what we're
Agreed.
saying.
Although it's hardly a substantial victory. That is a that is a Pyrrhic victory. Is that how you say it? Is it Pyrrhic or Pyrrhic? I think it's Pyrrhic, right?
Should we get into if it was a bluff and what the effects of that would be, or should we just keep going onto a different topic?
I kind of want to talk about the two commanding officers in the submarine that gave the go ahead to use nuclear torpedoes.
Well, yeah.
I feel like that's a
It
little
is
bit.
pronounced
Okay.
Pyrrhic.
We'll go on to the next subjects then. Do you want to? We should put all of these kind of in a group. I think you can.
And actually, speaking of the next subject, your talk about officers not necessarily complying with orders that were given is a really good segue into the next potential nuclear instance where the Cold War could have gone nuclear. Because in 1983, Soviet satellites picked up what they thought was an American nuclear missile strike. And the Soviet Union was totally geared up to send a response, except the Soviet officer, Stanislav Petrov, refused to launch, which turned out to be a pretty good call on his part.
That would have been close. Well, this is pretty risky for him in general. I mean, like, imagine if it was a missile. Imagine that.
Oh man, that would have been really
You
bad
would've-
for him.
Yeah. I just think about like all the what ifs, but yeah.
I
this
was
guy-
thinking in this scenario, he either he isn't there or he ends up deciding that to not question orders and fired the missile anyway.
I don't know. It would be.
Well, it'll be total
That's a close
nuclear
one.
annihilation probably.
Yeah, by that point, the Soviet Union definitely has the capability to destroy the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, if he fires a missile, then the U.S. will fire back, and then world over. That's a pretty simple one, right
What
here.
if we consider this now? Maybe like the Soviet Union fires a missile. What if we don't retaliate?
We die.
I mean,
Okay.
I
Seriously,
think,
maybe
right,
they'll realize
the
at a
Soviet
certain
Union fired
point.
a missile. Andy's point is not moot. I was actually thinking about that. Could they explain the situation? Been like, we got a false alarm. Could they resolve the issue?
You do realize nuclear weapons is just the destruction of humanity. I don't think, even if we were nuked, I don't think we're going to be that eager to just immediately retaliate and almost guarantee human extinction.
That
I
would
mean,
show weakness.
surely there must be at least some generals which would immediately respond by
Yeah,
firing.
but
But I definitely do think that there is the possibility for negotiations for the Soviet Union to explain, we messed up. But I feel like at that point it
yeah,
might
and I
be a
feel like
little
if the
bit
Soviets
too
offer
late.
enough reparations, it wouldn't really cause that big of a deal. I mean, yes,
Yeah,
millions of lives lost. That is absolutely terrible, but it is better than the entire extinction of the human race. And I feel like generals would have thought about this and would be
but
like, you know,
you
would we
know,
rather lose,
some
you
generals
know, a
might not
few
have thought
million
that. Some
people?
generals might have thought that, oh, the Soviets are trying to launch a preemptive attack to wipe out the entirety of the U.S. We're not going to go down that easy. We're going to take them with us.
Yeah,
It's all about precedent.
that's kind of I don't know. I don't know if I was a general, which I'm not, of course, but if I was a general, I wouldn't think like that. I would be like, I don't want to risk the entire human race just because of even if they launched like one or two nukes or something like that. And I'm sure some other generals had that thought process too, and they wouldn't have agreed to launch back. And
I think
I
it all
think
just depends upon
I think
how centralized is
it still would have
U.S.
happened.
command of nuclear weapons. How much control over the fire of nuclear weapons does the actual U.S. government have?
I think if they had fired to us, it would have been. I think we definitely would have fired back. I mean, I don't see how that would.
I mean, I think it's most likely we would fire back, but I'm just presenting the scenario that
Yeah, fair enough. Fair
if
enough. So
we didn't
if
fire
didn't
back, I think you know we'd all still be alive right now.
There's potential
It
for
would
that
be
to
resolved
happen.
somehow.
I would say Western Hemisphere of the globe is kind of destroyed though for like 100
Yeah.
years. I mean,
If they decide
I
to
mean, one
send that many
nuclear bomb
missiles.
would not destroy the entirety of the
Yeah, but the
continent,
thing
but
is,
presumably it would escalate and both sides would start firing back and forth, and that's what would cause
yeah, because I
destruction
think
of
the Soviets would have
in
fired
the Western Hemisphere.
they definitely would have fired more
than one. Yeah.
I think, and that would probably DC, New York. I don't know if
Yeah,
they can
that'd
reach
probably be the
California.
deal
At that
breaker.
point, could they reach California at that point?
By this point in the Cold War, the Soviet Union could hit anywhere in the U.S., and the
So then
U.S.
probably
vice
something
versa
like
could
LA
hit
and stuff
anywhere
like
in the
that.
Soviet Union.
They would just hit the major cities probably, and
Yeah.
the U.S. would no longer be a thing, and they would have to probably deal with fallout and the effects of that. Like, there'd be a lot of problems with the fallout, but I feel like in the end, the Soviet Union would prevail, even with nuclear
Yeah, if they
rain
got,
hailing down on them. But
I guess maybe it is a slight Soviet victory in the
Yeah,
same
they like
vein as
survive an
the
extra
Cuban
hour.
Missile Crisis would be for the U.S.
well, aren't we saying if we didn't fire back and we just said you guys played chicken, we aren't there for that. We're pulling out in like the
Yeah.
nuclear game
I'd
of
make us
chicken.
Well,
look pretty
I was
weak,
given
though.
this. I was thinking of this scenario where the Soviet Union only sends like one or two missiles back, which is yeah unlikely. But
I think it's
I
more
think
interesting to
It
think
doesn't
about.
hurt to think of that. If there's a possibility to save humanity, then that's an interesting possibility
Yeah.
to me.
Would we just say like we're done with playing this game of chicken? You win. You guys we're turning to the right. We're pulling out of the game of chicken, and you win. You call their bluff or something like that. And what would the effects of that be? Like overall, it would mean pretty much the annihilation of the United States, which would leave the USSR as the major superpower, right?
yeah,
And they would have
They
to
would
deal
have
with a
communist
nuclear
influence.
winter, but they would eventually come out on top 50 years later because after suffering a lot, because
well, they might not
there's no
even
one in
go
the US.
through nuclear winter. It depends
They
on
would.
again. So they get well, yeah. If they launch enough nukes, obviously they would. But if they do like 10, 20 nukes to all the
That
major
still
cities,
would be a lot. I mean,
I mean,
the
yeah,
nukes
that's a
now
lot,
are
and
pretty
that
powerful.
it would probably
10 or 20
cause significant
simultaneous nukes
environmental
would be
changes.
enough to destabilize a country very much.
I mean,
It
you can have.
interrupts
I'm pretty
food
sure there's a thing where
production.
you can drop like 6 nukes precisely around the Earth that cause nuclear extinction. If you drop them like in the precise place, you only need like 5 or 6 of them to
You do
destroy
it
humanity.
simultaneously.
Just in in specific places around the world. So dropping 100 on one place would probably at least cause a nuclear winter.
Well, very positions across the U.S.
Yeah, well, they would be in the big cities, right, and stuff like that.
And also suggesting that there would be governments left to negotiate after a full-on nuclear war
Well, I don't think.
overestimates the power of the United States and Soviet
Yeah,
Union.
Yeah.
no, I think the Soviet Union might be able to if the U.S. doesn't fire back. That's what I'm. I think that's what we should go.
Well, the Soviet Union would be in a
hypothetical.
position to negotiate, not
That's
the
very
U.S.
optimistic, assuming that the United States would not fire back.
Well, yeah, isn't that what we're? That's what I was trying to do the hypothetical of. You know, if like the U.S. just was bluffing the entire time and just wanted to save humanity rather than save their country and save like the president. You know.
I mean, yeah, I guess so. I don't know how that would.
Well, I'm just
I
saying.
mean, that's probably our best outcome. That is probably the most positive for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Assuming that the U.S. decides to be the quote unquote bigger man and not go with it. But I don't know. I mean, that's such an attack. That's such a brutal attack on a nation. I don't know if anybody would
Don't
be
think. No, yeah,
down
the
to
U.S.
not
wouldn't.
retaliate.
Yeah, I think the U.S. would definitely retaliate
Well, I'm
at
just
that
saying
point.
hypothetically. You know.
Yeah, but hypothetically, if they didn't attack, then the Western,
Yeah.
Eastern,
Western.
the Western Hemisphere would be annihilated.
Yeah.
As I was saying, the Eastern would survive.
And like, I feel like in 50 years, when all the nuclear winter is over, the USSR would reign like a supreme superpower now and would have pretty much dominance over the world. You know, if the U.S. didn't fire back.
Well, by 1983, the USSR was already kind of falling apart.
Yeah, but now they don't have their major enemy, and they don't have to spend a bunch of money.
Assuming they don't have to deal with the U.S., the USSR would be in a position to they'd be able to cut down on their military spending, which would probably help with the whole budgetary problems. I do think that eventually the USSR would, even in this scenario, they wouldn't face total collapse, but they would probably eventually. I mean, because under Mikhail Gorbachev, they were already going in this direction that I'm suggesting. They would eventually undergo economic liberalization and sort of become a quasi democracy or even a full one and embrace a semi free market system similar to the China we have today, assuming that Mikhail Gorbachev still survives and takes power in this scenario.
We talk about a couple.
I don't know. What do you guys think on that?
I think I don't know. I think
the USSR
may
fall apart during nuclear winter. No, because it'd be.
Wow,
Wow,
I mean, pretty stagnant during nuclear winter.
I don't know how stable the USSR food supply was at this point. I'm going to give them leeway and say maybe they could survive, but their how they did during their performance during any sort of their performance under stress during the 20s regarding food supply does not shine positively on their ability to keep their population well fed during a nuclear winter.
They would also probably be one of the lesser effective nations if they're on the other side of the globe. So that might also play into them.
Yeah, I guess the Western Hemisphere would be hit the hardest by this.
I mean, it would be probably collapse of a lot of governments and stuff.
Although that would probably lead to a recession, which might put the USSR in a position where it might not be able to hold out. Probably because of the lack of an America and the Western Hemisphere, probably a lot of nations in the Eastern Hemisphere would consequently collapse.
Yeah. I feel like you would get a lot of, in Europe, they would turn to communism, I think. Because, poverty usually turns people towards more, socialist ideas. So you could see that happen.
To be fair, the USSR had a fairly isolated economy relative to the rest of the world. They sort of had their own, I guess, communist sphere that they mostly did their trading.
Because
that would probably help them out if the U.S.
collapsed. Yeah, you wouldn't have to rely on the U.S. Because the U.S. that economy is just gone now, and a lot of countries are banking on that. So if they have a more separated economy, that's good for them.
Yeah,
You
they're
know?
not strapped into the car before it crashes, so to
Yeah,
speak.
exactly. That's an interesting analogy.
What?
That's an interesting, you know,
I think I heard it
analogy.
in I think I heard it in another history discussion, and I really liked it because they were talking about communism relating to the world economic system.
This next kind of close to nuclear war thing happened in 1967, where there was like interference in NORAD radars in the northern hemisphere, and this was thought to be like jamming of radars by the Soviets, and that is an act of war. So they thought they were jamming the radars so they can get nuclear strikes in, but the U.S. didn't act on it, and it was figured out later that it was just a very powerful solar flare that had um, knocked out some of these radars and had interfered with them, and it was very close to launching a nuclear bomb counterstrike, thought to be counterstrike. So that's kind of a small one, but kind of interesting how these systems aren't perfect and can mess up, and it's not just humans that can mistake stuff. It can also be the machine, so you can't have full trust in your machinery.
Oh, so we also had a close call on the side of the U.S. as
Yeah.
far
Oh
as
yeah, this is a good
almost
one on the
launching a
U.S.
nuclear
Yeah,
weapon.
Well,
that's
we've had
very
many
nice.
close calls. There was one time when planes like accidentally dropped like 4 nukes in the U.S.
Yeah, they actually dropped it
and one of them
because
was
the
actually
plane
close to blowing up.
blew up. Yeah, the plane failed, so the pilots they ditched the plane, and
Oh,
they
dear.
I'm pretty sure they only found two or three of them. There's still one more,
Oh God, that's
Wait, did they not
that's
actually
and
locate all of them? I don't
comforting.
there's
know if they
never been.
located all of them.
And now there's been like so they've said there's there's reported ones that the U.S. has reported, but now you think about like the USSR and how many they probably also had on transporting and mishaps with them. So you think about how many nuclear bombs are just laying around the USSR
Oh yeah, Russia's a
because
big place.
they probably they still have like secretive documents that have not been classified because they were like burned or destroyed, and so that we don't know how many nuclear bombs could have been accidentally dropped in the USSR and are still there today. So yeah, that's pretty interesting.
So basically, people are irresponsible.
Exactly.
I do find it
People cannot
interesting
be
though,
trusted.
in the system that tells you of a nuclear attack. I forgot what it was called. You remind me.
I think it's no, is it NORAD?
I'm not sure, but
No, they also
and that
track
system,
that.
and during that almost nuclear warfare,
Well,
it was because it was only avoided because I think it was a group of scientists or some sort of science research project that researched about the sun, and then they found out about this solar flare that was going to happen, and then it was them that actually explained that it wasn't actually
I
an
think that was
attack; it was just a solar flare.
If these
I think that was
scientists had
after.
not been present and had not explained it, do you think it would have come to nuclear war?
No. I think that was after. They just decided not to launch them
Oh,
Yeah,
because
yeah, I guess I think that was after.
I think it was just after the
Yeah.
scientists discovered that it was a very powerful solar flare and not a
Well,
jamming
no,
attempt
scientists
by.
researched before this event happened. It was like in '63 or something. It was a few years beforehand. They were researching the sun. Scientists were just researching the sun, just in some sort of project. Nothing, not really related to nuclear weapons, or at least I don't think it was. And then they discovered about this solar flare, and then they realized that this interfered. Like several years later, that this
They
was what
discovered that
interfered with it.
systems. Yeah.
so I think we've discussed some distinct possibilities where nuclear war could have occurred. Of course, there are more, and for anybody listening, eventually we are going to get a dedicated email for this podcast up and running. And if you guys have any more suggestions on things we could potentially talk about for when nuclear war occurs, feel free to drop an email when we actually get it up and running. And that concludes our first episode of our podcast.
You can also
Adios.
suggest stuff for us to talk about, other stuff as well.
Yes.
Like that. If you want to discuss other stuff.
The suggestions are definitely welcome.
And I would just like to say that Each podcast episode will probably be uploaded every Tuesday, starting from January 5th.
Try to do it every week. Yeah.
We'll try to do it every week, but we have a lot of schoolwork, so that may not be possible. But we'll try our
No
best.
promises, but semi consistently every week.
Yeah.
All right, see y'all around.